For centuries, royal families believed that marrying close relatives would protect their power. Instead, it destroyed them. Kings and queens were born with devastating health problems, mental instability, and physical deformities, all direct results of inbreeding. Some were too sick to rule. Others dragged entire nations into disaster. Dynasties crumbled under the weight of their own bloodlines. These rulers were deeply damaged before they ever touched a crown. This is the hidden cost of royal inbreeding, and here are 6 brutal, unforgettable examples that will leave you shocked, disturbed, and unable to look away. Charles II of Spain. When we talk about the dangers of inbreeding, no royal figure illustrates it more tragically than Charles II of Spain, known across Europe as El Hechizado, meaning the bewitched. But was he truly cursed, as many of his subjects believed, or was he simply the inevitable product of centuries of dynastic obsession with keeping power inside the family? Charles was the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, and his family's determination to preserve royal bloodlines led to over 200 years of intermarriage. Uncles married nieces, cousins married cousins, and the family tree twisted in on itself until it was less a tree and more a closed circle.
This is why royals married other royals, why they would never allow any marriage out of a royal family.
By the time Charles was born in 1661, the genetic consequences of this policy had reached a breaking point. His physical and mental condition made him a tragic figure in European history. One of the most visible signs was the infamous Habsburg jaw, a deformity so severe that his lower lip jutted grotesquely forward. His tongue was abnormally large, and he constantly drooled. He struggled to chew food and could barely form words. On top of this, his body was frail, his immune system weak, and he was plagued by illness throughout his life. For many Spaniards, his strange appearance and endless ailments seemed almost supernatural, hence the nickname the Bewitched. But in truth, he was a living case study of what relentless inbreeding could do to a royal line. One of the greatest tragedies of Charles's reign was his infertility. Despite marrying twice, once to Marie-Louise of Orléans and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, he fathered no children. His inability to produce an heir was the direct result of genetic collapse after generations of inbreeding. For a monarch, especially in the 17th century, infertility was more than a private sorrow. It was a political disaster. And this is where the historical consequences become clear. When King Charles II of Spain died in 1700 without an heir, it brought an end to the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty. This was not a minor dynastic problem. Spain controlled enormous wealth, vast colonies in the Americas, and important territories in Europe. The question of who would inherit Spain and its empire triggered one of the most important conflicts of the early modern period, the War of the Spanish Succession. The crisis began because Charles II named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his successor. If Philip became King of Spain, the French Bourbon dynasty would suddenly control both France and Spain. This terrified the other major powers of Europe. A united France and Spain could dominate trade, control the seas, and upset the fragile balance of power that had kept Europe in check. Britain, Austria, and the Dutch Republic quickly formed the Grand Alliance to oppose Louis XIV's plan. The war dragged on for more than a decade, fought across Europe, and even in colonies overseas. It was one of the first truly global wars. After years of bloody fighting, the conflict ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. The treaty allowed Philip to remain King of Spain, but under the condition that France and Spain could never be united under one crown. This compromise kept Europe from falling under French dominance, but also confirmed the decline of Spain as a great empire. The outcome changed Europe's political order. Spain continued to weaken, France was forced to restrain its ambitions, and Britain rose as a major naval and colonial power. All of this traced back to one man, Charles II, whose physical and mental decline caused by generations of inbreeding left him incapable of securing an heir. The collapse of his dynasty reshaped the continent and proved how a single king's personal tragedy could alter the fate of nations. Maria I of Portugal. Maria was the daughter of King Joseph I of Portugal and Mariana Victoria of Spain. Like most European royals of the 18th century, her lineage was already compromised by generations of close relative marriages. Instead of stopping the pattern, Maria continued it. She married her father's brother, Pedro III of Portugal. At first, she defied expectations. When she took the throne in 1777, Maria ruled with discipline, intelligence, and religious conviction. She reversed many of the harsh reforms of the Marquis of Pombal, supported education, and was respected for her sense of duty. Portugal entered a brief period of stability, but that order would not last. The breakdown began with the death of her confessor, Father Ignacio de São Caetano, in 1786. He was her spiritual guide and closest emotional support. His death triggered a visible change in Maria's behavior. 2 years later, her husband Pedro died. Then, in 1780, her eldest son and heir, José, died from smallpox. In just 2 years, Maria lost the 3 people she trusted most. Her response was immediate and severe. She stopped attending court, cried in public, and began showing signs of severe mental illness. Eyewitness accounts describe her alternating between uncontrolled weeping and long silences. She refused to bathe or change her clothes. She became fixated on religious visions, believed she was eternally damned, and claimed to hear the screams of souls in hell. At night, her screams were so loud that servants could not enter her chambers without restraint. Reports from the royal court and foreign envoys described her as incoherent, trembling, and incapable of ruling. Maria I's descent into madness didn't just destroy her own legacy, it left Portugal politically paralyzed during one of the most dangerous periods in European history. With the Queen legally alive but mentally incapacitated from 1792 onward, her son John, the future King John VI, assumed the role of Prince Regent. Though John tried to govern, his regency was marked by indecision, diplomatic isolation, and a constant struggle to keep Portugal out of Napoleon's line of fire. By the early 1800s, Portugal was caught between 2 great powers: Britain, its oldest ally, and Napoleonic France, which demanded that Portugal join the continental blockade against British trade. Prince John hesitated. He knew that obeying France would destroy Portugal's economy, which depended heavily on British imports and naval protection. But defying Napoleon would provoke military retaliation. Maria's mental illness meant there was no monarch to lead in crisis. The royal court had become reactive, fearful, and diplomatically fragile. In 1807, Napoleon had enough. He ordered General Junot to invade Portugal. With French troops advancing on Lisbon and no military leadership in place, John made a desperate decision. He fled. On November 29, 1807, the entire Portuguese royal family, including the incapacitated Maria I, escaped to Brazil under British naval protection. It was the only time in European history that a reigning monarch relocated the seat of power to a colony. The move preserved the monarchy, but it came at a high cost. Portugal was now ruled from across the Atlantic. The country was occupied by French forces and later became a battlefield in the Peninsular War. With the monarchy gone and the Queen mentally absent, political control fell into chaos. Guerrilla resistance rose among the Portuguese people. but coordinated leadership was nearly impossible. Internationally, Portugal was seen as a weak link, barely sovereign and wholly dependent on Britain. Maria I's long decline had already weakened court institutions, and her absence during the crisis made stable governance unachievable. Even in Brazil, Maria's presence was a burden. She had to be hidden from the public, and resources were spent on her care, while the court tried to maintain an image of royal legitimacy. When Maria died in 1816, the monarchy passed to her son, but the damage was done. Portugal had survived, but its sovereignty had been repeatedly violated, its capital looted, and its political identity fractured. The Queen's mental illness had not only ended her reign, it had exposed an entire nation to foreign invasion, humiliation, and dependency. King George III of Great Britain. Born in 1738 into the House of Hanover, King George III, like many European royals of the time, George married within his family to preserve lineage. His wife, Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, was his first cousin. This union continued a long history of inbreeding within the Hanoverian line, which modern historians now believe played a direct role in his catastrophic mental and physical decline. There is still debate over the exact nature of George's illness. Some researchers believe he suffered from porphyria, a hereditary blood disorder that can cause confusion, abdominal pain, hallucinations, and discolored urine. Others suggest he endured severe episodes of bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. Regardless of the final diagnosis, there is broad agreement that his symptoms, both mental and physical, were exacerbated by his family's genetic history. Unlike other monarchs who struggled with physical disabilities, George's condition manifested almost entirely through psychological deterioration. The consequences were brutal.
14 motions and you call it mild? I could have manured the whole parish.
In 1788, during one of his most severe breakdowns, George reportedly talked incessantly for hours, often without any connection to reality. Witnesses recorded that he foamed at the mouth, gestured wildly, and screamed about hearing the voice of God. He would fail to recognize his wife or children, and even attempted to shake hands with trees, believing them to be foreign dignitaries. These were not isolated events. They recurred for decades, with periods of lucidity followed by terrifying collapses. A widely documented incident occurred during King George III's first major bout of illness in 1788 to 1789, when he became convinced that he had been given divine instructions. According to records from court observers and physicians, he ordered that all convicted criminals in London's prisons be immediately pardoned and released because he believed God had commanded him to show mercy. The command was irrational and dangerous, given the state of crime in Georgian England, and it alarmed Parliament and his ministers. George reportedly issued the order repeatedly, despite being told it violated the law.
The king is incapacitated.
His doctors and advisors were forced to ignore or delay the request while trying to manage his deteriorating state. He was eventually physically restrained and placed under constant observation. This episode was one of several that led Parliament to seriously consider declaring him unfit to rule and temporarily transferring power to his son. Court physicians subjected George III to extreme and invasive treatments considered standard medical practice in the 18th and early 19th centuries. He was repeatedly bled using lancets or leeches, under the prevailing belief that madness resulted from an imbalance of the body's four humors, especially excess blood.
30 guineas a visit and travelling expenses.
Large quantities were drained from his veins in an attempt to rebalance his system, often leaving him weakened and delirious. Hot metal plates were also applied to his skin to induce blistering, especially on the back and legs, causing severe burns and excruciating pain. This method, known as counter-irritation, was believed to draw out internal toxins or bad humors by creating external wounds. The idea was that visible sores would somehow relieve the internal inflammation of the brain or nerves thought to cause madness. In practice, It only added physical agony to his psychological torment. He was also forcibly restrained in straitjackets for hours or days at a time, and in extreme episodes, he was confined to solitary cells within Kew Palace. These padded rooms were meant to prevent self-harm, but functioned more like prison cells. He was denied meaningful human contact, and his cries during these episodes were said to echo through the palace halls. Eyewitnesses, including physicians and royal staff, reported hearing him scream in pain, babble incoherently, and plead for release. The treatments not only failed to improve his condition, but often exacerbated his distress, leaving him confused and physically broken. His condition destabilized the monarchy. By 1811, his insanity had become permanent. He was blind, deaf, and delusional. His final years were spent in total darkness, both literal and mental. He never knew that his beloved daughter, Princess Amelia, had died in 1810. His handlers kept the news from him, fearing it would push him further over the edge. George III died in 1820 after nearly a decade of complete mental collapse. The empire he once ruled stretched across continents, but the man who wore the crown spent his final years broken, alone, and lost inside a mind that had turned against him. The effects of George III's illness were long-lasting. He was king during major events like the American Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, and the early growth of the British Empire.
What is this? America, I suppose?
No, sir.
Oh, America's not to be spoken of, is that it?
But during key moments, his mental breakdowns damaged the image and stability of the monarchy. In the American colonies, George was first seen as a harsh and unfair ruler. But when word of his mental health spread, he was portrayed as a man who had lost control of his mind. Revolutionary leaders used this to show that British rule was dangerous and unstable. They argued that no free people should be ruled by a king who could not think clearly. This helped fuel support for independence. In Europe, George's condition became a target of political attacks. Napoleon's regime in France often mocked the British king in newspapers and posters, calling him mad and unfit to lead. They claimed Britain itself was falling apart under a broken monarchy. George's illness also changed how people thought about royal power. It forced the public to ask hard questions. What happens when a king cannot rule? Who should decide if he is fit to stay in power? These concerns helped push Britain further toward a more modern, constitutional monarchy, Don Carlos of Spain. From the moment Don Carlos was born in 1545, his very existence reflected the dangers of inbreeding. His parents, Philip II of Spain and Maria of Portugal, were first cousins. This fit the Habsburg tradition of marrying within the family to keep dynastic power intact. The result was a dangerously high level of shared genetic material. In simple terms, too much of the same blood ran through his veins. The consequences were clear from childhood. Don Carlos was small and frail, with a hunched back and uneven shoulders. He suffered from constant illness and repeated head injuries that only worsened his condition. Contemporary accounts also describe him as mentally unstable. He was cruel to servants, violent toward animals, and unable to control sudden rages. For a time, the court tried to hide these flaws, but as he grew older, his behavior became impossible to disguise. By his late teens, Don Carlos was openly reckless. He pulled knives on courtiers, threatened nobles, and even assaulted women. What made matters worse was his position as heir to the throne. A king was supposed to symbolize divine order and stability, yet Carlos brought fear and chaos into the very center of Spain's most powerful court. The breaking point came in 1568. Don Carlos became involved in secret dealings with rebels in the Spanish Netherlands, who opposed Philip II's harsh rule. His father discovered that his son had spoken openly of plotting against him, and had even hinted at plans to kill him. For Philip, this was not just disobedience. It was treason within his own bloodline. Philip II acted swiftly. He personally ordered his son's arrest. Don Carlos was locked away under heavy guard in the Palace of Madrid. He was stripped of weapons, books, and contact with the outside world. What followed was one of the most shocking acts in Spanish royal history. a king imprisoning his only son and heir. Don Carlos lasted only 6 months in confinement. He refused food, injured himself, and his already fragile health collapsed. In July 1568, at the age of 23, he died in his cell. Rumors spread quickly that Philip had ordered poison, and the story was used by his enemies to paint him as a tyrant. But most historians today believe Carlos's death came from natural causes made worse by starvation and neglect. The consequences of Don Carlos's life and death were devastating for Spain and for the Habsburg dynasty. His downfall left Philip II without a stable heir at a critical moment in the 1560s. Spain was already strained by rebellion in the Netherlands, the threat of Ottoman expansion, and growing tension with England. A strong crown prince might have projected confidence and continuity. Instead, Europe saw a dynasty with its future locked in a prison cell. Philip was forced to remarry and try again for heirs, exposing to the world the fragility of a line that claimed divine authority. The deeper tragedy, however, was what Don Carlos represented. His sickness, instability, and violent decline were symptoms of generations of intermarriage, a dynasty sacrificing the health of its children in order to keep power inside its own bloodline. Don Carlos became the living proof that the Habsburg marriage policy was destroying itself from within. Ferdinand I of Austria. Born in 1793, Ferdinand was the son of Emperor Francis II, the last Holy Roman Emperor. By the time Ferdinand entered the world, the Habsburgs had already been practicing close intermarriage for centuries, and the consequences were becoming impossible to hide. From birth, Ferdinand's health made him a fragile heir. He suffered from severe epilepsy, experiencing violent and unpredictable seizures that sometimes occurred in public, shocking courtiers and foreign visitors who saw the man expected to rule. He also had hydrocephalus, which caused his head to be abnormally large and misshapen, and he struggled with basic motor control. Simple tasks such as walking or writing were difficult for him, and his speech was slurred and hard to understand. Court reports describe him as unable to follow long conversations or fully grasp complex political issues. Doctors of the time, lacking real treatments, often subjected Ferdinand to crude remedies that reflected the medical ignorance of the age. He was regularly bled, a practice where physicians drained blood from his body in the belief it would balance his seizures. He was also given mercury-based medicines, toxic substances thought to purge illness from the body, but which only weakened him further. His daily life was controlled by strict regimens set by court doctors, including enforced bed rest for long periods, restricted diets of bland foods, and limits on physical activity. These measures were meant to keep his seizures under control.
His health continues steadily to improve.
But in reality, they left him weaker, isolated, and dependent on attendants for even the simplest tasks. His seizures sometimes lasted for hours, and attendants feared he would not survive into adulthood. When he did, it was seen less as a triumph of medicine and more as a cruel extension of his misery. In an age when emperors were expected to lead armies in person, make decisions in the face of Europe's constant wars, and balance shifting alliances, Ferdinand was completely unequipped. His condition was so debilitating that even within his own family, rumors spread about his inability to fulfill the role. Ministers and advisors quietly prepared to rule in his name long before he ever wore the crown. Despite his lifelong illnesses, Ferdinand was crowned Emperor of Austria in 1835, after the death of his father, Francis II. On paper, he was the ruler of one of Europe's most powerful empires. In reality, he was never able to govern on his own. Day-to-day power was held by a regency-style council led by influential statesmen such as Prince Metternich and members of the imperial court. This was not just a private tragedy for a sick man forced into a role he could not fulfill. It was a profound political problem. The mid-19th century was an age of revolutions, rising nationalism, and industrial transformation. Austria, with its vast territory and mix of ethnic groups, Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Croats, and many others, needed strong, flexible leadership to manage growing tensions. Instead, it had an emperor who could not adapt or lead in moments of crisis. Because Ferdinand could not rule, his council clung to old policies. Austria became increasingly conservative and resistant to reform. Demands for constitutional government and greater freedoms were ignored. Nationalist groups, especially in Hungary and northern Italy, grew restless. The empire stood still while Europe moved forward. The breaking point came during the revolutions of 1848, when uprisings spread across the continent. In Austria, protests and riots erupted in Vienna and elsewhere, shaking the very foundations of the monarchy. The empire could not rely on Ferdinand to manage the crisis. He was overwhelmed and incapable of leading troops or negotiating reforms. Advisors and family members decided the only solution was his abdication. In December 1848, he gave up the throne in favor of his young nephew, Franz Joseph I, who would go on to rule for nearly 70 years. Ferdinand's abdication was more than a personal failure. It symbolized the dangers of dynastic inbreeding and the weakness it created at the top of European power. Ferdinand himself is remembered as a tragic figure rather than a cruel one. Accounts describe him as gentle and even likable, but good intentions could not hide the fact that he was incapable of ruling. History judged his reign not by his character, but by the empire's stagnation and eventual crisis. Cleopatra VII of Egypt. When people think of Cleopatra VII, they often picture a powerful and intelligent queen who had famous relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony.
The armies of my lord Caius Julius Caesar are advancing even now without opposition upon Alexandria.
But behind the political drama and glamour was a deeper issue. Cleopatra came from a royal family that practiced inbreeding for centuries. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great, believed that marrying within the family, often between siblings, would keep their bloodline pure and their power strong. Cleopatra herself ruled alongside her younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and later Ptolemy XIV, and both were also her husbands. This pattern of inbreeding had serious long-term effects. Over generations, marrying siblings reduced the family's genetic diversity. Historical records describe earlier Ptolemies as sickly, mentally unstable, or physically weak. Although Cleopatra was smart, well-educated, and politically skilled, she still carried the genetic risks of centuries of intermarriage. In the end, the dynasty's long-term decline was not only political, but also biological. Cleopatra did have children, but not with her royal brothers. She had a son with Julius Caesar, Ptolemy XV, known as Caesarion, and later 3 more children with Mark Antony. However, these children were born to Roman fathers and not part of the pure Ptolemaic bloodline. This weakened their claims to the throne. After Cleopatra's suicide in 30 BCE, Caesarion was captured and killed by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. Her other children were taken to Rome and removed from power. With no accepted heir left, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to a complete end. Egypt became a Roman province. Cleopatra's death came at the end of a disastrous war with Rome. After her ally and partner Mark Antony lost the Battle of Actium to Octavian, both fled back to Egypt. As Octavian's forces closed in, Cleopatra tried to negotiate, but she quickly realized her position was hopeless. Mark Antony committed suicide after receiving false news that Cleopatra had died. Soon after, Cleopatra took her own life, most likely using poison, rather than be paraded through Rome as a defeated queen. Cleopatra's life shows that royal inbreeding was not just a problem in Europe. The Ptolemies suffered from both physical consequences and constant internal fighting. Because there were so few eligible heirs, Cleopatra had to battle her own brothers for control, which led to civil war and made Egypt more vulnerable to Roman influence. In the end, the dynasty's decision to keep marrying within the family helped cause its downfall both by weakening its rulers and by making it easier for outsiders to take over. What do you think about inbreeding? Comment down below.